Essential Progressive Rock Albums, episode 10,492. And today I am offering this, Robert Fripp's greatest album. Yep. And this features the greatest incarnation of King Crimson ever. So I've started with some contentious things here. This album's an absolute bloody masterpiece, isn't it? Robert Fripp, the guy that ended up being the de facto leader of King Crimson, a band that was full of geniuses on that first album and basically invented progressive rock as we know it. But then because you had an album, a band full of geniuses, they all started fighting. And then for me, King Crimson do some incredible stuff, and they're exploring the same sort of areas of fusing rock music with classical music and darkness and Bartok and all that type of stuff that they're doing across a whole bunch of albums that I was never very keen on, for the same reason I'm not keen on Van der Graaf Generator. If you love Van der Graaf Generator, you probably love those albums. I was never so keen on those. They are great albums, I'm not going to knock them. But in 1973, Robert Fripp reconvenes King Crimson, and he brings this sort of dark, almost like heavy metal Mahavishnu approach to King Crimson, with Lark, Stungs and Aspic, Stars of the Bible Black and Red. These are some of the most important albums in the history of progressive rock. And I'll throw USA in there, and the box set that came out later on called The Great Deceiver. At that point, Robert Fripp then decides to disappear into a commune and study esoteric spiritual practices under the guidance of the Gurdjieff devotee J.G. Bennett, who had studied under the great mystic Gurdjieff, somebody who I've been very interested in for a number of years if you watch this channel, but also had then gone on to explore other ideas like Subud, and he put all that together in a very English commune out in the countryside that Robert Fripp entered in 1974. By 1977, he re-emerges, I think, a different person, and I think a person that was a little bit more well-balanced and wasn't causing some of the trouble that I think he was when he was in the proper incarnation of King Crimson. Although still a difficult guy, I think his very unique vision for music had now been consolidated and was less destructive. And he goes to New York, and he starts to take in influences from all sorts of people. A lot of the bands that are out there, you know, like Blondie and the Ramones and Talking Heads, a whole bunch of people. And whilst he's in there, he goes into the studio and makes this. Now, you would expect this to be his sort of take on New Wave, which he eventually does in the band League of Gentlemen, and then consolidates and brings back progressive rock influences in the third incarnation of King Crimson, which is the 80s King Crimson. They did another trio of incredible records. And again, for the third time, Fripp redefined what progressive rock was. But in the middle of all that is this album, which I believe is an utter masterpiece, an absolute masterpiece. And I think in terms of any parameter that you want to discuss, this is his greatest album. I really think it is. This album was made as part of a trio of albums. All right. Fripp himself says on here, this album is originally conceived as the third part of a middle-of-the-road trilogy. What does he mean by that? With Daryl Hall's solo album, Sacred Songs, Peter Gabriel 2. He was also working at this point, producing an album by, is it Daryl Hall? So there's all this thing. I just said that, Daryl Hall's solo album, Sacred Songs. See, I wasn't listening to it. Why would I expect you to listen to me when I'm not even listening to me? And the delay by dinosaurs of this album, it is impossible to convey the sense of which I intended. So he had a vision of bringing these three albums out, all looking into three different areas. And we can see Daryl Hall as a pop band moving slightly towards progressive rock ideas, and we can see Gabriel as a progressive rock artist moving towards more punky new wave song ideas. Those two albums are great, but they're nowhere near this for me. When I discovered this album, I went out and got Peter Gabriel too. It's a good album, it's a great band, but it's not like this. And so this was recorded between 1978 and 79. And what we have is a whole ton of musicians on here. And they're all playing on different tracks. And it's really hard to explain what this runs like, because it's like a prog album in that once the album starts off, it never lets up. You could almost see it as two sidelong suites. It's got spoken word, electronica, ambient experiments. You've got punk rock stomps, and certain points it's full on prog. It opens up with preface, and I think preface contains elements of the teaching of J.G. Bennett. It's all sort of, we end up in that thing. It's got that incredible intro with all those multi-track vocals doing these cascading harmonies. Absolutely brilliant. And you know you're into a progressive rock album. So here you are going, all right, this is a really weird album, sort of new wave progressive rock album. And then it goes to You Burn Me Up, I'm a Cigarette, which is like a new wave punk track, which I believe has got vocals by Peter Hamill. I think he's singing in that, and he's absolutely incredible on it. I'm not a fan of Peter Hamill and Van de Graaff Generator, but growing up I was very aware of him because he's on this album, and I thought he was incredible on here. Then it goes into the track of Breathless. And like I said, Breathless is basically a trio of Robert Fripp on guitar, Tony Levin on bass, and then our Lord and Master, Narada Michael Walden on drums. And for me, this is the greatest incarnation on that track of King Crimson. If you haven't heard it, go and listen to it. It then goes into a track called Disengage, which is sort of new wave proggy madness. We then get all sorts of experimental tracks on here. There's a track called NY3, which is a recording made through the wall of a hotel room that Fripp made of a son and daughter arguing, and you get a transcript of that argument. At one point, I've got a little bit of a cough. At one point, you get the whole inaugural address of J.G. Bennett that he gave to his followers, or what you want to call them, disciples, I don't know what you call them. And it's compressed. You can slow it down and hear it, but it's all on here. Towards the end of the album, it's in between two sort of ambient tracks, Water Music 1 and Water Music 2, we have Here Comes the Flood, which is a version of a track that I believe was on the Peter Gabriel album. Peter Gabriel's singing on here, and it's possibly, in terms of songwriting, Peter Gabriel's finest moment. This is an absolute masterpiece of an album, and it's unique in that it exists on its own with nothing really near it to compare, which is weird for Robert Fripp because he tends to work in batches, and he has concepts, and he often, because whether he is a follower of the law of three, which I'm sure he is if he's a good Jeff, and you tend to get these groups of 3 albums that are so key, and then he moves on. Here he was trying to do that, and it failed. If you think about it, he was trying to create this trio of albums. It didn't happen. He then forms League of Gentlemen. That isn't quite right. I think the musicians didn't have the virtuosity to fulfill Robert's vision, and then he pulls together the album that features Tony Levin, which is this new bass player of the new prog. He's actually come from jazz rock world, Bill Bruford, and the great Adrian Belew is coming from David Bowie's band, Zappa's band, and Talking Heads. And he makes 3 albums that then do exactly what the Red Stars of the Bob Black and Lark Stunning and Aspic did for sort of 70s progressive rock. And he created new styles of music. This is a heavy thing, but I feel it's all encompassed on this. And if you wanted one album that represents Robert Fripp and King Crimson and his ambient music and stuff he did with Brian Eno and everything, it would be this album, wouldn't it? Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, stick a like on the like button. Go and press it right now if you liked it. If you want to see some more, you can subscribe. If you want to support me, you can go over to Patreon. And over at Patreon, you can join the Andy Edwards Club. You can meet new people, talk about music. You can see all the new content, get involved in what I'm doing here and all that type of stuff. But if you don't want to do that, you can give me a tip. I don't mean like, say, have a shave, Andy, because you're looking a bit rough today. A tip like a financial tip in my PayPal YouTube tip jar. Thank you very much. See you on the next video.